May 24th, 1685. Dunnottar Castle, Aberdeenshire. A door opens in the rock. It leads down into a vault cut into the cliff face, a low-ceilinged chamber, perhaps 50 feet long and 15 feet wide. One small window seaward-facing set high in the wall. No light reaches the floor, no ventilation worth the name. 167 people are pushed through that door, men and women, some old, some young. All of them arrested for the crime of refusing to accept the king's authority over their church. All of them Presbyterians, Covenanters, who had signed or supported a declaration that God alone was the head of the Kirk of Scotland, not the Crown. The door is locked. It is May. The summer ahead is long. 25 of those 167 people will die in that room. The survivors will be shipped as slaves to the plantations of the West Indies, and those who try to escape through the one small window above the cliff will face something almost worse. This is the Whigs' vault of Dunnottar Castle. Most people have never heard of it. They should have. To understand the vault, you have to understand the rock. Dunnottar sits on a stack of stone rising 50 meters above the North Sea, connected to the mainland only by a narrow neck of rock. To attack it frontally, you would climb down from the cliff top and cross that neck. Storm a gatehouse cut directly into the rock. The path is so narrow that attackers could only advance 2 or 3 abreast. Anyone defending the gatehouse from above could hold it with a handful of men. People have understood this since the Dark Ages. There is evidence of a Pictish fort on the rock going back to the 5th century. A medieval chapel was built on the promontory in the 7th. By the 14th century, it was in the hands of the Keith family, the Earls Marischal, hereditary keepers of the Scottish regalia. They would spend the next 3 centuries expanding it into one of Scotland's largest castle complexes. It contained a great tower, a palace, and a chapel. And carved into the cliff face below the main castle buildings was a set of vaulted chambers used as storage and, when needed, as a prison. William Wallace besieged Dunnottar in 1297. According to chronicles, an English garrison took refuge in the chapel, which Wallace set on fire, burning the soldiers alive inside. He couldn't take the castle proper, which gives you a sense of how formidable the position was even then. To understand the Whigs' vault, you have to understand a conflict that modern audiences may find strange: a war over how to run a church. In 1638, tens of thousands of Scots had signed the National Covenant, a declaration that the Church of Scotland should be governed by its own elected assemblies. This was not merely a religious position, it was a radical political statement that there were limits to royal authority and that ordinary people had a right to resist. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 reversed all of this. Episcopacy, rule by bishops, was reimposed. The Covenanting movement was declared illegal. Its leaders were executed or exiled. Its followers were fined, imprisoned, and harassed. Many refused to submit. Throughout the 1660s and 70s, Covenanters held illegal outdoor worship services, conventicles, in fields and on hillsides, sometimes armed, always watched. Government troops were sent to disperse them. A series of small rebellions flared up and were suppressed. Prisoners were taken, executed, or transported. The period became known as the Killing Time. In 1685, after the failed Argyll Rising, the crackdown intensified. Suspects were rounded up across Scotland, regardless of direct involvement. The dragnet swept up fighters, anyone who had attended a conventicle or been reported. In the spring of 1685, 167 of these prisoners were marched to the northeast coast of Scotland, to the rock, to the door, to the vault. The vault the prisoners were confined in measured roughly 50 feet by 15 feet. The ceiling was low. The single window was small enough that even a child could not pass. It faced the open sea, which in late May on the Aberdeenshire coast means cold wind, salt spray, and near constant grey light. 167 people in that space. They slept in shifts. There was no sanitation. They were given a bucket, which was not emptied regularly. The smell within days would have been overwhelming. There was no running water. Water was brought to them in limited quantities by the guards. Food was similarly restricted. Some accounts describe periods of near-total deprivation. This was not a formal execution. The government's position was that these people could leave at any time. All they had to do was sign an oath swearing loyalty to the king's authority over the church. Most refused. The refusal itself was the defiance. Signing would have been the betrayal of everything they had held on to, and so they stayed. By June, people were dying. The causes were a mixture of dysentery, dehydration, and suffocation from the lack of fresh air. The bodies had to remain in the vault with the living until the guards opened the door. 25 people died in that room. A number of others were released after signing oaths under duress, and were then publicly humiliated for having done so by their own community, who considered it capitulation. The majority who held out were told they were being transferred. They were put on ships in late July. Their destination, the sugar plantations of New Jersey and the West Indies, where they would work as indentured servants, effectively as slaves. Several ships carrying Covenanter prisoners sank en route, drowning everyone aboard. The contrast between a summer tourist visit and what that room was is the episode in miniature. Getting through it required being pulled up to a height of several feet and squeezing through an opening barely wide enough for a human body. On the other side was the sheer cliff face of the promontory, dropping hundreds of feet to the rocks and the North Sea. They tried anyway. Some accounts describe prisoners tearing cloth from their own clothing to fashion ropes, lowering themselves down the cliff face in the dark, aiming for rocks below where sympathizers with a boat might be waiting. Some made it. Some lost their grip and fell. The rocks below the seaward wall of Dunnottar were not forgiving. Those who were caught, either recaptured on the cliff or turned in by informers, faced punishment that went beyond the confinement itself. Contemporary accounts describe prisoners who were caught in escape attempts having their hands and feet mutilated. Others were simply killed on the spot and their deaths recorded as accidents. The guards were not acting outside their orders. The official position was that these prisoners were traitors, enemies of the king's religious settlement. Harsh treatment was encouraged. The man directly responsible was George Keith, the 4th Earl Marischal, whose own family had owned the castle for 300 years. His name is in the records. He authorized the conditions. He received reports on the deaths. He was never tried for any of it. The killing time ended in 1688, when William of Orange invaded England and James VII fled. The surviving prisoners were released. The Presbyterians had won, but the 25 who died in the vault did not live to see it. Before the Covenanters, Dunnottar was the scene of a different kind of drama, one that ended better. The story of the Crown Jewels. In 1651, Oliver Cromwell's new model army invaded Scotland. Cromwell had defeated Charles I and was now reducing Scottish resistance. In Edinburgh, the Scottish Parliament faced a problem. The honours of Scotland, the Crown Jewels, could not fall into English hands. Cromwell had already seized the English crown jewels and melted them down to make coins. The same fate awaited Scotland's. The honours were moved to Dunnottar. The castle was, as it had always been, essentially impregnable. Cromwell's forces besieged it for 8 months without taking it by storm. But 8 months is a long time. The garrison was running out of food. The castle would eventually have to surrender, and when it did, Cromwell's soldiers would search every inch of it. The governor's wife, Anne Lindsay, arranged what happened next with the help of a local minister and his wife, Christian Fletcher. Visitors were still permitted access to bring supplies. On one of her visits, the minister's wife left with more than she arrived with. The crown, the scepter, and the sword of state were hidden, bundled into the cloth of a maidservant carrying flax, and walked past the besieging English forces, past the army that was there specifically to prevent exactly this, down the road to the village of Kinneff. The minister and his wife buried them under the floor of Kinneff Church. Dunnottar fell in May 1652. The English soldiers searched the castle thoroughly. They found nothing. The honours of Scotland stayed under the church floor for 11 years, until the restoration of Charles II in 1660. The minister dug them up periodically to air them and check for damage. He did this in secret, at night, alone. They are now on permanent display in Edinburgh Castle. They are in perfect condition, the oldest crown jewels in the British Isles. Dunnottar Castle is a ruin. Most of it has been a ruin since 1718. The castle was stripped, its roofs removed, and it was left to the rain. What remains is substantial. The Great Tower, the Palace Block, the chapel. Enough to understand the scale of what was here. Walking around them, with the sea visible through every window on 3 sides, is genuinely disorienting. You are never not aware of the drop. The Whigs Vault is still there. You can go inside. It is low, damp, cold even in summer, and darker than you expect. There is a small marker acknowledging the Covenanting prisoners. The castle draws tourists for its dramatic appearance. It has been used as a filming location, most notably for the 1990 film of Hamlet, where it doubles as Elsinore. The irony of using a vault where 25 people died as a backdrop for Shakespearean tragedy is either perfect or appalling. Dunnottar Castle is famous as a photograph. The dramatic cliff-top silhouette, the ruins against the sky. It is extraordinary to look at. What is less known is the vault in the cliff face, the texture of what they endured, the heat, the smell, the weeks. The view from that window, a rectangle of grey sky and open sea, and below it, nothing but rock. Some of them died looking at that window. The castle stood the whole time. The castle is still standing.